So what are we going to do today for the next 30 or so minutes, and then in discussion and the workshop for the original documents? We're dealing with what has been called, quite triumphantly, the world's greatest democracy. Okay? But the original design of the Constitution was decidedly elitist. Okay? It requires all states to provide a Republican form of government. That's Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. And it itself was a Republican document, as defended in the Federalist Papers, for example. But what does that mean? And my take on this is going to be the electoral take, voting and the rights to vote. Think about the selection of office holders under the original Constitution. I'm talking about the 1789 Constitution. President is elected not by the people, but by the Electoral College. And we screwed that up with the election of 1800. And although it netted us a really nice Broadway play that is still traveling around the country and made Alexander Hamilton a star, we botched that election, and the 12th Amendment is an effort to fix the Electoral College. But the people did not vote for the president. Electors did, and electors were selected in different ways in different states. So there is no suffrage right for the presidency. Take a look at Congress. The Senate originally was selected by state legislatures. And the people did not elect their senators. State legislatures did, or at least they determined how senators would be selected. The House was the only branch of the national government that was elected directly by the people. Okay, and so we, the people, voted for the members of the House of Representatives. Obviously, the Supreme Court and inferior courts have no connection whatsoever to the popular franchise, save for the president nominates and the Senate confirms. Okay. What I'm going to sort of develop today, and what we can talk about in the question and answer period, and we'll fool around with when we look at the primary documents, is the notion that democratic elements have been grafted onto the Constitution. The Constitution itself is an a-democratic document. It's not hostile to democracy necessarily. It's founded on popular sovereignty. But the institutions and the peopling of those institutions were not handled initially, at least, by the people. Okay. So over time, what has happened in the United States is an expansion of the notion of we the people. And that's what we're going to look at today and then talk about in the question and answer period and in the primary documents period. All right. So this is a painting of the Second Continental Congress. And why start with the Second Continental Congress, which predates the Constitution? It predates the Bill of Rights. It predates the 14th Amendment and all other amendments. Why start with the Second Continental Congress? Because of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. And these are the three principal characters. There are 5 people on the committee that wrote the Declaration. But here you have Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, moving from right to left. And this is just a parenthetical aside that I was thinking about when I was putting this together. There are dangers in having children. Liz didn't mention we've got 3 kids, and 2 of them think it's really funny to give me presents with my face on them. So 2 years ago, they gave me this, which is the painting you just saw with my face for Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. So there are dangers with having kids. It looks like a painting. It hangs in my office. They call it the Founding Joes. Okay. But those are the guys, not me, but those are the guys who are responsible for writing the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Adams, I want to focus on briefly, because this will come back as we talk about the expansion of we the people. John Adams was one of the members of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. Massachusetts delegate, And obviously became the second president of the United States, quite a famous and established, accomplished human being. He was married to Abigail Adams, okay? She was not formally educated, but she was self-educated and a very bright and erudite woman, and also extraordinarily intelligent. When John was away, which was a hell of a lot at the time, because he's ambassador to France during the war and the like, when he was away, she essentially took care of the homestead in Massachusetts. She had 6 kids. 4 of them were living in 1776 when the Second Continental Congress met. She ran the farm when John was gone, and she engaged in this long and loving correspondence with him. And actually, some of the letters are a little bit toasty, which is impressive. It's, you know, your founding fathers with some passion. But that's not why I'm talking about the Adams family here. I'm talking about the Adams family because of something that Abigail wrote to John during the Continental Congress that wrote the Declaration of Independence, and she knew that he was involved in this, okay? So what did she write? I long to hear that you've declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So this is an early claim, not only toward to political equality for women with men, but also for the franchise, okay? This is John Adams' wife writing to John Adams. So what did the Declaration of Independence say? All men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The only way government has legitimacy is if the people consent to it, okay? Whenever government is destructive of that, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, okay? So this is your sort of classical small L liberal claim. Government's legitimacy comes from the consent of the people. Now, what does that mean in 1776? Abigail said it should mean all the people, men and women, okay? But the Declaration simply was a declaration separating from Great Britain, and it didn't actually set up a government, okay? The thing that set up the government was the Constitutional Convention. So what does the Constitution say about the people and who will constitute the government, who will have political authority? This is the preamble, right? We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, okay? But who are the people? That's what we're going to unravel here. And one of the things I tell you at PowerPoint school, and if you've seen me or heard me or dealt with me in the past, you know that I've never gone to PowerPoint school, is not to throw tons of text up onto slides. Since I didn't go to PowerPoint school, I didn't learn that. The reason I throw tons of text up is because I work with text, and so do you. And secondly, this will be in, I think, a box in a cloud somewhere. And you are more than welcome to take anything you want to from this PowerPoint and use it in your classes, okay? So here's a bunch of text that some of it may be useful for you in class, and so you're going to see a chunk of text here. Focus today is the right to vote. Who are we the people, okay? And remember, the House is the only body of the national government under the original Constitution that the people select, that people vote for representatives, okay? Who votes for the House? And the answer here is electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. What that means is that if you could vote for the Texas Assembly, you could vote for a representative, okay? But that leaves the decision as to who will vote in the hands of the states. Now, some states had really high property qualifications. Okay. Other states had middling property qualifications. A few states, Pennsylvania among them, had no property qualifications. So your capacity to vote as a citizen of the United States under the Constitution depended on whether your state would let you vote. So states made that decision. We, the people, varied from state to state. Okay, that's the House. And the Senate, again, the people had absolutely no role to play in choosing senators. Senators were chosen by state legislatures. Okay. Slavery. Slaves had no political rights under the Constitution. In fact, the word slavery doesn't appear in the Constitution, and you'll see this a little bit later, until the 13th Amendment. Okay. But how did they treat slaves in terms of we the people? Okay. And the way they did was by crafting the 3/5 clause. That's in Article 1, Section 2. That says basically representation in the House of Representatives will be determined by all the free people in a state, plus 3/5 of all other persons. And all other persons are slaves. Okay. So that is a constitutional nod to the institution of slavery, and it gives African Americans no political authority whatsoever and counts them as 3/5 of a white person for determining the apportionment of legislators in the Congress. Okay. This is the importation ban. And again, no mention of slavery. Migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall to admit can end by congressional action in 1808. Okay. So you're treating blacks the same way you would treat cattle. Slaves are property. They are not political entities. They have no political authority. And just to put a fine point on that, Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause, says if a slave should get away, even if the slave gets into a state where there is no slavery, where it is illegal, that state has to help return him to his owner. Okay. So you've got white men of various property attainment able to vote for the House of Representatives. Obviously, slaves cannot. What about women? That empty space is not a mistake because there's nothing at all about women in the Constitution. It is completely empty of reference. And this is an important point and something that is fun to play with students. Sometimes what is not written is as important as what is written. So the mere fact that women were invisible, and again, go back to Abigail Adams, don't make us invisible. You are tyrants. We will revolt. They have no rights, at least no suffrage rights under the Constitution. It's not even important enough to be put in the Constitution. All right, so the original Constitution, 1789. Who are we the people? White males with property. Okay. That's the first constitutional take on we the people. Then history happens, okay? The link there is to U.S. history. It's got a nice little summation of Jacksonian democracy. Jacksonian democracy is the first stage of democratization, putting more democratical elements on the system of government in the United States in the history of the country. And there are two dimensions of relevance here, okay? One is the rise of political parties. The people who wrote the Constitution didn't foresee political parties arising. In fact, they thought they were a sign of corruption. One of the great ironies is that two of the principal authors of the Constitution, Hamilton and Madison, were primary agents in creating the political parties. But they didn't think they were going to exist, okay? Jacksonian democracy is about Jackson and Jacksonians building a political machine to elect Jackson to the presidency. He came close in 1828. or 1824. He finally won in 1828. All right. And the reason was because he was able to mobilize voters in states who would vote for electors pledged to him. Okay. The whole push behind this was essentially to get somebody like Jackson into office. And to do that, you had to have a broader suffrage. So what happens is something called universal manhood suffrage. Now, universal isn't really universal. It's white guys, okay? And what happens is that property qualifications largely disintegrate because state legislatures take them away. So by the time you get into Jacksonian democracy, starting in the 1830s, we the people has expanded. Okay, what you've got are white men with property and white men in general. Okay, so we the people by the 1830s are white men. Okay. Then the Civil War brings upon what is really the first effort on the part of the national government to address the question of voting. Now, the Civil War is a complex web of issues. There's a whole bunch of constitutional theory associated with Calhoun's concurrent majorities and that stuff. There were strong sectional differences. For example, the lifestyle in the North and the lifestyle in the South were radically different. The economic systems in the North and in the South were radically different. And of course, slavery. Right? There was slavery in the North, although it was not as widespread as it was in the South, because it wasn't as essential to the economic system. Okay? For our purposes today, we're going to focus on slavery and equality and citizenship, because we're talking about we the people. And we've already seen that the original Constitution leaves blacks out. Okay. By the time you get to Jacksonian democracy, universal manhood suffrage is universal manhood suffrage for white guys. So, what do you see before the Civil War? You see Dred Scott, which says that blacks cannot be citizens of the United States. They only have the rights that white men are willing to give them. You have Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War, freeing the slaves in the South by emancipation or by proclamation. And then you have Appomattox, where Lee surrenders to Grant. The North wins. Okay? Winners write rules. And Lincoln, because he was terrified that after the war, Congress would repeal his Emancipation Proclamation, pushed really hard for an amendment to end slavery, not just in the formerly rebellious states, but in general. Okay? That's the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865. It ends slavery, involuntary servitude, and it does so on a national level. Okay? So no matter where you are, you cannot be enslaved by a local or a state law. That is unconstitutional. Okay? But they weren't done. Okay? The 14th Amendment is passed after Lincoln's death. And this becomes significant, as you'll see, when we talk about the expansion of the people that occurs. And this is going to bleed into what Laura and Kevin talk about in the next 2 weeks, because the 14th Amendment is the most litigated section of the Constitution at this point in time, has been for years. Okay? What's significant here? In red, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deprive them of due process, nor deny them equal protection. Okay? States can't do this. States have limits imposed on them by the 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment imposes limits on them, saying you cannot have legal slavery. That is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment says states cannot deny people privileges and immunities, due process, or equal protection. Okay? Now, the question coming out of this is who gets to vote? Who are we the people now? And the pictures in front of you are Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. Okay. They were all in the abolitionist movement. The suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement were wedded together prior to the war, and then in the immediate aftermath and Reconstruction. All of those people wanted African Americans, former slaves, to be able to vote, and women to be able to vote. And in fact, women suffragettes had been kicking about for quite a while. Well before the Civil War, there's the Seneca Falls Convention and Seneca Falls Declaration, which mimics the Jeffersonian Declaration of Independence, except with Abigail Adams's voice. Okay, so if you look at the grievances, just again in parallel structure to the general Declaration of Independence, it's all the things men have done to deny women their equality and their freedom. Okay, so given those grievances, what's the resolution? It's the duty of the women of this country to secure themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Women need to get the vote. Okay, so coming out of this, Douglas and Stanton and the suffragettes, Anthony, push for an amendment that extends the suffrage to men and women. Congress was not ready to extend the suffrage to women, and so Douglas broke away from Stanton and Katie Smith and said, okay, we'll just have an amendment that protects suffrage for former slaves, former male slaves. And that's your 15th Amendment, right? The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. What that does mean is while states can't deny the vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, they can deny the vote on other characteristics. I say age, perhaps sex, and states did. And we'll look at Minor v. Happersett in the document section here. So after the Civil War amendments, 13th and 14th and 15th, this is what we the people look like. All men, at least formally. Okay, obviously Jim Crow puts a wrench in this, and we'll talk about that briefly in a second, and we can talk about that in question and answer if you wish. But this is what we the people stands for in 1870. Now notice how the circles are growing. There are more people brought into who we consider as we the people, but there's still a lot out there, okay? What happens as time goes on, especially with the populist and then the progressive movement, is that people start advocating for a broader use of suffrage. Remember, the original Constitution doesn't provide for the popular election of senators, but the 17th Amendment, passed in 1913, does. So after 1913, senators are directly elected by the people of the states. Legislatures no longer elect them. If you look at the last paragraph, and I always throw this kind of stuff in because politicians are politicians. They were at the beginning of the country, they were in the middle part of the country, and they are today, okay? Notice that this is a change. Prior to 1913, if you're a senator, it's because you were elected by a state legislature. The last paragraph makes sure that even if you were elected by a state legislature, you get to stay in office. This amendment shall not be construed as to affect the election or term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. So they protected the incumbents and then moved forward to allow election after 1913 when seats came open. All right, the suffragettes come back, okay? And they come back in the face of the progressive push for greater political participation. Stanton and Anthony are gone, but a new generation of suffragettes, Alice Paul, among others, she's on the right, come to the fore and press for the Abigail Adams position, remember the ladies. Okay. Now, initially they were sold out, the feminist movement and women suffragettes, by Frederick Douglass in 1870, because Douglass believed it was more important for Black men to get the vote than to push to try to get men and women to vote. Okay. The court the Supreme Court dealt with this question in a case that we'll look at in a couple of minutes called Minor v. Happersett. Okay, short story or short sort of summary of it. Woman wants to vote in Missouri in the presidential election of 1872. The registrar in her county refuses her to give her a ballot because she's a woman, and Missouri does not allow women to vote. So she sues, and she goes to the Supreme Court. There's nothing about sex or gender, as we saw in the 15th Amendment, but the 14th Amendment has this privileges and immunities clause. Okay, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens in the United States. So what Happersett argued, or excuse me, what Minor argued was one of the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States is the right to vote. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, said, yeah, well, women are citizens and they have privileges and immunities, but the right to vote isn't a privilege or immunity of citizenship. Okay, and we'll look at Waite's reasoning in a few minutes. But the effort to use one of the new amendments to expand the concept of we the people fails in Minor v. Happersett. Okay, this led again to the push for a voting rights amendment, and you finally get it with the 19th, which is passed in 1920. So after the 19th Amendment, we the people have grown again. We've moved from white propertied men to white men to all men to men and women. So the concept of we the people enshrined in the preamble is an elastic concept, and it is expanding with time. Okay? Now, just to bring us to more or less the present day, talk a little bit about the civil rights movement. Jim Crow, which was occasioned by Plessy v. Ferguson and separate but equal, was dying a slow death before the Supreme Court. And some of these cases are in your TEACs, your standards. Kevin will talk about some of them when he talks about the Equal Protection Clause. But all of these cases start to eat away at segregation and discrimination based on race, efforts to try to keep African Americans suppressed politically. Congress also gets into the act with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But there are constitutional amendments that arise out of this. And again, remember, the Constitution originally said the only people that get to vote are those who can vote for the House of Representatives, and states get to determine who those are. Right? The national government swings into gear with amendments starting in the 1960s. The 23rd Amendment allows people in the District of Columbia to cast electoral votes for president. Before, since the District of Columbia isn't a state, if you lived there, you couldn't vote for president because there were no electors for the District of Columbia. Only states had electors. The 23rd Amendment gives the District of Columbia, which is predominantly in population African American, electoral votes for the presidency. Okay. So DC now, people who live in DC can vote for the president of the United States. They don't have a senator, they have a non-voting representative, but they can vote for the president of the United States and have those votes counted. We the people grows. All right. And again, growing out of the civil rights movement, the 24th Amendment. You can no longer, states can no longer deny someone the right to vote for failure to pay a tax, a poll tax or some other kind of tax. States can't charge you to vote. That obviously lifts barriers to voting off of the shoulders of those who cannot afford to pay a poll tax. Okay, so that enfranchises more people. So now the notion of we the people has grown yet to include those whose poverty would keep them from being able to pay for the right to vote. And then the Vietnam War brings you the last nationalization of the right to vote, the 26th Amendment, meaning that if you're old enough to die in Vietnam, you're old enough to vote for the people who are going to send you there. So 26th Amendment extends the suffrage to everyone who is over the age 18 or older. So this is we the people. We start with a small circle, and that circle gradually expands over time. Yeah. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is still a matter of contention, and your students may have some interest in this, further puts the federal government in the role of making sure that people who have a right to vote can vote. It's based on the 15th Amendment, and it was passed in 1965. All right, so that's the journey of we the people. It takes us from the Constitutional Convention, which creates the Constitution and defines we the people very, very narrowly, to the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the expansion of we the people. We the people today is not we the people of the founding era. So, pulling all this stuff together before we open it up for questions. The basic argument that I just presented to you is that the Constitution and the government that was created by it was not initially democratic. We the people, the first phrase of the preamble, was initially more we the select people, we the elite people. But we the people proved to be an elastic phrase. It expands over time. The concept of we the people gradually changed over time. And what you have seen is democratic elements grafted onto a document that was not designed to be democratic. We the people broadened in fits and starts over time, and we see it that it is still evolving today. Okay. In the workshop, we'll look at the Minor v. Happersett case that I mentioned briefly when we're talking about women's suffrage. And we'll also look at U.S. v. Gwynne, which is a case that outlawed the grandfather clause. And we'll look at how the Supreme Court reads, interprets, and applies those constitutional amendments we just talked about.